In March 1998 inches, a quiet rural corner of Oregon, a 2-year-old child vanished from the front yard of her own home. There were no cries for help, no signs of struggle, no clear direction in which the child had gone. Only a small toy remained on the grass exactly where it had been left. Within minutes, an ordinary morning became a question that would not settle. How can someone disappear from the safest place they know without leaving anything behind? If you are listening to this story today, how did you first hear about it? The part of Oregon where the Walker family lived was not marked by anything that drew attention. The land opened wrong and flat, in some places uneven and wooded in others, with long stretches of road where a car could pass without meeting another for several minutes. Houses sat far apart, not because people wanted distance, but because that was simply how the land had been settled. Neighbors knew each other by habit rather than proximity, by recognition more than conversation. On that morning in March 1998, the air was cool but gentle, the kind that carried the smell of wet grass and earth without cutting into the skin. The sky was pale and steady without clouds, heavy enough to suggest rain. It was the sort of morning that invited routine, not caution. The Walker house faced the road without a fence. The front yard spread outward, openly, a patch of grass broken only by small, uneven areas where the ground dipped slightly. There were no trees close enough to block the view, no structures that created blind spots. From the front door, everything could be seen. Lily Walker was already outside. She had been placed there earlier, not with ceremony or instruction, but with the unspoken understanding that this was where she often spent time. At 2 years old, Lily did not move with intention toward distance. She stayed within the small circle of familiarity, drifting a few steps, stopping, turning, then drifting back again. Her attention was guided by whatever caught her eye in the moment. A small yellow toy car lay on the grass nearby. Its surface was scratched, the color no longer bright but softened by use. Lily pushed it once, watched it roll unevenly, then crouched and touched the grass instead. The toy stopped where it was forgotten exactly where it had landed. Inside the house, Rebecca Walker moved through the kitchen, setting something down on the counter, rinsing her hands, glancing briefly toward the window without stopping. She did not linger there. The yard did not require watching. Children played outside in this place all the time. That was normal. Anna Walker passed through the doorway and back again, her movement restless but unremarkable. She stayed close enough to the yard to be aware of Lily, without paying attention to her every step. At 4 years old, Anna had learned where she was allowed to go and where she was not, but she had not yet learned to think in terms of risk. Michael Walker stood near the front of the house, already preparing to leave. He mentioned going for a run, his voice even casual, the words blending into the morning without stopping it. Running was part of his routine. It did not require discussion. His uniform hung nearby, as it often did, a reminder of his work, even when he was not wearing it. Before stepping outside, Michael looked toward the yard. Lily was there. Anna was nearby. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency. He stepped onto the road and began to run his figure, moving away from the house at a steady pace, soon becoming just another shape in the stillness of the land. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly. Time continued without announcement. Lily wandered a few steps, then stopped again. She stood still for a moment, then turned. She did not cry. She did not call out. Nothing in her behavior suggested discomfort or fear. The road remained empty. No vehicles passed. The yard stayed quiet, open, unchanged. Rebecca continued what she had been doing inside the house. Plates were moved. Water ran briefly. The sounds were ordinary, unremarkable, the kind that would later be remembered only because of what followed. When Michael returned, he did not arrive in a hurry. He slowed as he reached the yard, his breathing steady. His eyes went first to where Lily had been earlier. She was not there. At first, the absence did not fully register. Children stepped out of sight all the time. Michael took another step forward and looked again, his gaze moving across the yard, then back to the same spot. The yellow toy car was still there. Lily was not. "Lily," he called, his voice carrying across the yard in a tone that still expected an answer. Nothing answered back. He called again, louder, this time the expectation beginning to thin. Rebecca heard the change in his voice before she heard the words clearly. She stopped what she was doing and moved toward the doorway. "What is it?" she asked, stepping outside. Michael did not answer right away. He was looking around the yard, then toward the road, then back again, as if repeating the motion might produce a different result. She was just here, he said, not loudly, not urgently yet, but with confusion edging into his voice. Rebecca stepped fully into the yard, her eyes following the same paths his had taken. She walked a few steps, then stopped, scanning the ground as though Lily might be sitting somewhere just below eye level. She's not behind the house, Michael said, more to himself than to her. Rebecca moved toward the side of the house, then back again. The yard looked exactly the same as it had earlier. Nothing had been moved. Nothing disturbed the grass. Anna stood nearby, watching the adults move in ways they had not been moving before. Anna, Rebecca said, her voice careful. Where is Lily? Anna hesitated. She looked toward the road, then back at the yard. There was a truck, she said, finally, her words slow, uncertain. It went that way. The statement did not land cleanly. It hung between them, incomplete. What do you mean? Michael asked, turning toward her. Anna shrugged slightly, unable to add more detail. It was there, she said. And then, Lily wasn't. Michael stepped closer to the road, looking farther out now, his eyes tracing the empty stretch of land beyond the yard. Rebecca stood near the toy car, staring down at it. She wouldn't leave this, Rebecca said quietly, though she knew Lily often did. Michael did not respond. He was focused on the distance, on the direction Anna had indicated, on the time that had passed without sound. Minutes slipped by, stretching longer than they should have. The yard remained quiet. No one approached from the road. Lily did not appear from anywhere she might have wandered. Rebecca's movements slowed. She stood still for a moment, then bent, slightly touching the toy car with her foot, as if confirming it was real. Where could she have gone? She said, the question more breath than sound. Michael looked back toward the house, then toward the road again. The run he had just finished pressed into his thoughts, though he did not speak of it yet. The morning no longer moved forward. It circled the same moment again and again. Lily playing, Michael leaving, Michael returning, Lily gone. The land around them stayed unchanged, wide and open, and indifferent, offering no direction, no answer. And in that stillness, with nothing broken and nothing explained, the understanding settled in slowly, not as panic, but as something heavier, that whatever had happened to Lily Walker had happened quietly, in a place where nothing ever seemed to happen at all. For a brief moment after the words left Anna's mouth, no one spoke. The yard seemed to hold its breath, as though the space itself were waiting for someone to correct what had just been said, to add a detail that would make it less unsettling. The road remained empty. The grass did not move. Nothing arrived to interrupt the silence. Rebecca was the first to speak again, though her voice came out lower than before. A truck, she asked, not challenging the idea but trying to understand its shape. Anna nodded, uncertain, her eyes fixed on the road as if the answer might still be there, waiting to be seen. She did not describe a color. She did not point to a direction with confidence. What she offered was not a story but a feeling, a memory that had not yet settled into words. Michael did not ask another question right away. He was already moving, stepping farther toward the road, scanning the distance where the land dipped and rose again. From where he stood, the road stretched out in both directions, long and open, with nothing to slow a vehicle and nothing to hide one either. If a truck had passed, it was already gone. Rebecca stayed closer to the house, her eyes returning again and again to the toy car in the grass. She bent down and picked it up, brushing dirt from its side with her thumb, then set it back down where it had been. The motion was small, almost unconscious, as though touching it might steady something that had begun to tilt. She can't have gone far, Rebecca said, more to herself than to anyone else. She wouldn't. Michael turned back toward the yard. His face had changed, not dramatically, but enough to register. The confusion that had been there moments earlier had tightened into focus. Check behind the shed, he said. And the side of the house? Rebecca nodded and moved quickly, circling the building, calling Lily's name as she went. Her voice carried farther, now no longer shaped by expectation but by need. The name echoed faintly, unanswered. Michael walked toward the edge of the property, stepping into the grass beyond the yard, scanning the ground as though looking for something he could follow. He crouched once, then stood again, his eyes tracing lines that did not exist. Anna stood near the doorway, watching the adults move in ways that felt unfamiliar. She clutched her hands together, her earlier words now hanging in the air, without anyone knowing how to hold them. Minutes passed, marked only by repeated calls of Lily's name and the sound of footsteps moving in widening circles. The house was checked, then checked again. Closets were opened. Doors were pushed aside. Every place that could be seen was seen more than once. Nothing changed. Rebecca returned to the front yard, her breathing faster, now her movements sharper. She looked at Michael, who was standing near the road again, his attention fixed outward. "She's not anywhere," Rebecca said, the words breaking slightly as she spoke them. "She's not here." Michael nodded once. He did not argue. He did not suggest another place to look. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone. The call was short. His voice was controlled, professional, the way it often was when he spoke on duty. He did not explain much, only enough to be understood. When he ended the call, he stood still for a moment, looking back at the house, then at the yard. "They're coming," he said. Rebecca did not ask who. She already knew. The waiting that followed was not empty. It was filled with movement that led nowhere, with repeated glances toward the road, with the sound of Rebecca calling Lily's name again and again, as if volume alone might close the distance that had opened. Anna sat on the front step, her legs tucked in close, her eyes moving between her parents. She did not speak again about the truck. No one asked her to. The first vehicle arrived quietly, pulling up along the road without lights or sirens. A uniformed officer stepped out, his expression shifting as he took in the scene. He listened as Michael spoke, his posture changing from casual to alert. Another vehicle followed, then another. The road that had been empty earlier now held unfamiliar shapes, parked at angles that marked the beginning of something formal. Questions were asked gently at first, then more precisely. When was Lily last seen? Who had been with her? How long had Michael been gone? Michael answered without hesitation. Rebecca added what she could, though her words came more slowly now. Anna was asked what she remembered, and she repeated what she had said before, no more clearly than the first time. "She said a truck," one of the officers said quietly, not writing it down yet, only acknowledging it. The yard was walked again, this time by people who did not live there. They moved carefully, their eyes trained on the ground, on the edges of the grass, on the spaces where something might have been disturbed. They looked for marks, for impressions, for anything that suggested movement or direction. There was nothing. A dog was brought in, its leash held tightly as it was guided toward the place where Lily had been playing. It sniffed the ground, circled once, then twice, its behavior changing as it failed to settle on a path. The handler frowned, adjusting the leash, guiding the dog farther out. Still nothing. As the light shifted and the morning wore on, more people arrived. Some were neighbors, drawn by the presence of police vehicles. Others came because they had been called, because someone they knew had asked them to come help look. They spread out along the road into the surrounding land, calling Lily's name, their voices overlapping and fading. Rebecca watched them move, her hands clasped together tightly, her eyes following every figure that disappeared into the distance and returned without Lily. Michael moved between the officers, answering questions, offering details, his professional familiarity with the process now colliding with the fact that it was his yard, his child, his morning being examined. The land around the house remained unchanged, wide and open, and stubbornly silent. The same grass, the same road, the same sky that had greeted the morning, now held a growing crowd and an unspoken understanding that something had gone wrong in a place where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. As the search widened and voices filled the air, one thing became clear, without anyone needing to say it aloud. Whatever had taken Lily from that yard had done so without force, without noise, and without leaving behind a direction that anyone could follow. And with every passing minute, the space between when she had last been seen and where she now was grew wider, heavier, and harder to bridge. It was still the same day, the same morning in March of 1998, when the space around the Walker house crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, because what had begun as a search conducted by a family and a handful of officers now took on a shape that belonged to procedure, rather than instinct. By late morning, the road in front of the house no longer looked empty. Several vehicles were parked along the shoulder, spaced unevenly, their doors opening and closing as officers moved in and out, speaking briefly before heading in different directions. The yard, which had earlier held only Lily's scattered movements and the yellow toy car, was now crossed repeatedly by people who had not been there before, their steps careful, their eyes trained downward. Michael Walker stood near the front of the property, answering questions again, this time more formally, his words measured as he walked through the morning once more, starting from when he had decided to go for a run, explaining the route he usually took, the pace he kept, the amount of time he believed had passed before he returned. He pointed once toward the road, indicating the direction he had gone, then lowered his hand, his gaze returning to the yard. An officer stood with him, writing notes, occasionally asking him to clarify a detail, not because the answers were unclear, but because they needed to be fixed in sequence. Michael did not resist the repetition. He understood its purpose. Rebecca Walker was asked to sit for a moment at the edge of the porch, where another officer crouched slightly to be at eye level, his voice calm, his questions slow. He asked her when she had last seen Lily, what she had been doing inside the house, whether she had heard anything unusual. Rebecca answered as precisely as she could, though her recollection now felt blurred by the number of times she had already replayed it in her mind. "I didn't hear anything," she said more than once. "Nothing at all." Anna was brought closer to the house, away from the movement in the yard, where a female officer spoke to her gently, asking her again about what she had seen. Anna repeated what she had said before, her words unchanged, still incomplete, still shaped more by impression than detail. She spoke of a truck of movement of Lily not being there afterward. When asked what color it was or where it went, she shook her head, unable to add more. The information was noted, not dismissed, but not acted on yet either. By early afternoon, the search radius expanded beyond the immediate property. Officers coordinated with volunteers who had arrived from nearby homes, directing them toward specific areas rather than letting them wander. Some were sent along the road in both directions, instructed to look into ditches and tree lines. Others moved into the open land beyond the yard, spacing themselves out, calling Lily's name at intervals. Dogs were brought in again, their handlers leading them to the spot where Lily had last been seen. The animals sniffed the ground, circled, paused, then moved without committing to a trail, their behavior watched closely by the people holding the leashes. When the dogs failed to pull decisively in any direction, the handlers exchanged brief looks, then guided them farther out, widening the attempt. Still nothing held. The yellow toy car remained near the center of the yard, now marked by the quiet attention it received from anyone who passed it. No one moved it again. It sat as a reference point, an unspoken reminder of where Lily had been that morning. As the afternoon wore on, the light shifted, shadows stretching across the grass, changing the way the ground looked without revealing anything new. The temperature remained cool, the air steady, offering no discomfort that might have shortened the search. There was no weather to blame, no condition that explained the lack of progress. Michael was asked to walk the area again, retracing his steps from earlier that day, pointing out where he had been when he left and where he had returned. He did so without hesitation, his familiarity with such reenactments evident in the way he moved and spoke. Yet this time, the reenactment did not clarify anything. It only reinforced the narrow window in which Lily had disappeared. Rebecca watched from the porch as he walked the yard, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the space where Lily had been playing. She held the toy car, now turning it slowly in her hands, her thumb tracing the worn plastic as though committing it to memory. By mid-afternoon, the conversations among officers shifted again, their tone more deliberate, their movements more structured. Radios were used more frequently. Names and times were exchanged. Decisions were made quietly without announcement, but their effect was visible in the way the search continued to push outward rather than inward. The idea that Lily might simply be found nearby, unharmed and confused, began to recede, not because anyone said so aloud, but because every place she could have reached on her own had now been searched more than once. As evening approached, the land around the Walker house looked much the same as it had that morning, unchanged by the hours of movement it had absorbed. The grass remained upright. The road remained open. There were no signs of struggle, no disturbed areas, no marks that suggested direction or force. What had changed was the understanding of the people standing there. Rebecca rose from the porch and walked back into the yard, stopping near the place where Lily had last been seen. She looked around once more, as though the repetition itself might produce something new, then turned away, her expression tight, her movements slower now. Michael stood with several officers near the road, their heads close together, their voices low. Whatever was being discussed did not result in a new path to follow. It did not produce a name or a vehicle or a direction. It simply acknowledged the reality that had been forming since morning. As daylight began to fade, the search did not stop, but it changed. Lights were brought in. Plans were discussed for continuing into the evening. The yard, once the center of attention, became just one point among many in a widening effort. And as the day of March in 1998 drew toward night, the Walker family remained standing on the same land where Lily had played that morning, now surrounded by people and procedure, with the growing certainty that whatever had taken her from that yard had done so without leaving, behind a trail that could be followed before the day was done. As evening settled over the same day in March of 1998, the light around the Walker property changed from pale to muted, and then from muted to artificial, as portable lamps were set up near the road and along the edges of the yard, their glow cutting uneven shapes into the surrounding darkness. The land that had felt open and exposed in daylight now seemed larger, more difficult to read its distances, stretching farther once the sun was gone. The search did not stop when night arrived. It reorganized. Officers spoke in quieter voices now, their movements slower, more deliberate as they discussed where to continue and how to divide the effort. Some volunteers were asked to leave, not because their help was no longer wanted, but because exhaustion had begun to show, and the risk of missing something important increased when people were too tired to see clearly. Others stayed holding flashlights, walking familiar paths again, calling Lily's name into the darkness, listening for anything that might answer back. Rebecca Walker remained near the house, wrapped in a jacket she had not needed earlier in the day, her attention fixed outward, even as her body showed signs of fatigue. She watched the beams of light move across the grass and disappear into the distance, her hands clasped tightly together, then loosening, then tightening again, as though the motion itself helped her stay present. Michael Walker stayed close to the officers coordinating the search, his posture attentive, his focus sharp despite the hours that had passed. He answered questions as they arose, repeated details when asked, and offered information about the area that might be useful, pointing out paths, low spots in the land, places where someone unfamiliar might miss a turn. His familiarity with procedure was evident even as the situation remained deeply personal. Anna was taken inside the house as the night deepened, guided gently by an officer who spoke softly, explaining that it was time for her to rest. She did not protest. She moved quietly, her earlier words about the truck now absorbed into the larger effort around her, no longer singled out but not forgotten. Through the night, the search continued in cycles. Groups went out and returned. Radios crackled with brief updates that offered no breakthrough. Dogs were brought in again, then rested, then brought out once more, their handlers adjusting strategies, trying different starting points, different directions, hoping for a change that did not come. By the time dawn approached, the land around the Walker home had been covered again and again, not once, not twice, but enough times that the repetition itself began to feel heavy. Still, nothing appeared, no sign of Lily, no object belonging to her beyond what had already been found, no indication of where she might have gone. When the sun rose on the following morning, the yard looked almost unchanged, as though the night's effort had left no mark at all. The grass stood upright. The road lay open and quiet once more. Only the presence of additional vehicles and unfamiliar faces hinted at what had happened there. The second day brought a shift in tone. Additional resources were requested. Officers from outside the immediate area arrived, their presence signaling that what had begun as a local response had grown into something larger. Maps were unfolded. Areas were marked and divided. Search grids replaced instinctive wandering. Helicopters were discussed, then brought in, their sound cutting through the air as they passed overhead, scanning the land from above in wide methodical sweeps. From the ground, their movement offered both reassurance and unease, because each pass that failed to produce a result narrowed the possibilities further. Media attention followed soon after arriving, not as a single moment but as a gradual presence. Vehicles parked along the road. Cameras appeared. Reporters spoke quietly among themselves, careful at first, observing the scene before asking questions. Officers managed the perimeter, balancing the need for information with the need for space. Rebecca was asked whether she wished to speak. She declined. Her silence was not strategic, it was instinctive. She remained focused on the search itself, on the people moving through the land, on the hope that the next group to return might bring something different. Michael spoke briefly when necessary, his words measured, his tone controlled. He did not speculate. He did not assign blame. He repeated what was known, what had been seen, and what had not been found. As the days passed, the search expanded beyond the immediate surroundings. Nearby properties were checked. Bodies of water were examined. Roads leading away from the area were reviewed. Each step extended the effort outward, pushing farther from the place where Lily had last been seen. The idea of a truck resurfaced periodically, mentioned in quiet conversations, revisited by investigators who attempted to determine whether any vehicles had passed through the area that morning. Neighbors were asked what they had seen if anything unusual had stood out. Some remembered vehicles. Others did not. None could describe a moment that clearly explained Lily's absence. Time began to take on a different quality. Hours blurred into days. The initial urgency remained, but it was now accompanied by structure, by schedules, by briefings held at set times. The search became something that continued, even when individuals needed to rest, sustained by rotation rather than momentum. The Walker house became a fixed point within that system, a place people returned to for updates, instructions, and coordination. It no longer felt like a private space. It was the center of an effort that extended far beyond it. Rebecca moved through those days with a focus that bordered on narrowness. She ate when reminded. She slept in short intervals. Her attention never strayed far from the idea that Lily might still be found, that the absence might still be temporary. Michael continued to engage with the investigation, his dual role as father and deputy, creating a tension that did not go unnoticed. He was part of the process, yet also subject to it, his actions and movements now observed with the same attention given to everything else connected to the case. By the end of the first week, the land around the Walker home had been searched thoroughly enough that repetition replaced discovery. Still, the effort did not stop. It adapted. And as the days following that March morning continued to pass without resolution, one reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. Whatever had happened to Lily Walker had occurred quickly, quietly, and within a window so narrow that even an entire community searching together could not yet see where it had led. By the time the second week after Lily Walker's disappearance began, the urgency that had driven the early days of the search no longer depended on motion alone, because movement without direction had already taken the search as far as it could go. And what remained now was the slower, more deliberate, the work of looking back at the same hours again, this time with questions that had not been asked at the beginning. The focus shifted inward, not away from the land, but toward the timeline itself. Investigators began returning to the morning of March in 1998, breaking it down into smaller pieces, asking not what had happened in general, but what had happened first, then next, then after that, and how much time had passed between each moment. The questions were not accusatory. They were procedural. But their repetition carried weight. Michael Walker was asked again about his run. Not in passing, not as part of a broader conversation, but specifically with a map laid out on a table. Lines drawn to indicate the route. He said he had taken the usual pace he kept and the amount of time he believed had passed before he returned to the house. He described it calmly as he had before, pointing out the direction he ran, the turn he usually made, the stretch of road where he slowed down. An investigator followed along with a finger, measuring distance, then looking up. The timing did not quite fit. It was not dramatically wrong. Not enough to draw attention on its own, but enough to prompt another question, then another, about whether the run had been shorter or longer than usual, whether he had stopped at any point, whether anything had delayed him. Michael answered each question, adjusting his estimates slightly, explaining that time could feel different when measured after the fact. The adjustments were noted. Separately, attention turned to Michael's patrol vehicle. Records showed mileage that extended beyond what would have been expected for routine use around that time. A difference that was not large enough to be obvious without looking closely, but large enough to raise interest once it was noticed. Investigators asked about it directly, not as an accusation, but as a request for clarification. Michael explained that he often used the vehicle for work-related reasons, sometimes without logging every movement in detail, especially during off hours. The explanation was plausible. It did not immediately contradict anything else. Still, the mileage was written down. Rebecca Walker was spoken to again as well, this time with questions that focused less on the morning itself and more on what had followed in the days after. Investigators asked about Michael's behavior, about whether anything had seemed unusual, about whether there had been changes she had noticed but not thought important at the time. Rebecca answered carefully. She did not describe dramatic shifts. She spoke of silence, of long stretches where little was said, of routines continuing because stopping them felt impossible. She did not suggest suspicion. She did not point fingers. Anna was no longer questioned repeatedly. Her statement remained what it had been from the beginning, unchanged, despite the passage of time. The idea of a truck remained on record, neither dismissed nor confirmed, existing in a space where it could not yet be placed. As the investigation continued, smaller details from the early days were revisited. One incident, initially considered unrelated, drew renewed attention: a report involving a firearm, a stray animal, and a claim that a shot had missed its target. When records were reviewed more closely, the report did not match the description exactly. The discrepancy was minor technical, the sort of thing that might be overlooked under normal circumstances. Now it was not. Michael was asked about it and he responded without defensiveness, acknowledging the difference, explaining the stress of the moment, the imprecision of memory under pressure. Again, the explanation was reasonable. Again, it was noted. Individually, none of these details carried enough weight to change the direction of the case. They were not evidence. They were not proof. They were inconsistencies small enough to exist within the range of human error. Together, they began to form a pattern that required attention. Investigators did not announce this shift to the family. They did not need to. The change could be felt in the way questions were framed, in the way conversations lingered a moment longer than before, in the way notes were taken with greater care. The land continued to be searched, though less intensively than during the first days. New tips came in, each one followed up, each one leading nowhere. Reports of sightings were logged and checked, none confirmed. The road that had once been the center of attention became just one of many possibilities, none more convincing than the last. Rebecca moved through this period with increasing quiet. She was present for conversations when needed, but she did not insert herself into discussions that had become more technical, more procedural. Her focus remained fixed on the idea that Lily might still be found, that the search had not yet reached the right place or the right moment. Michael remained cooperative, answering questions, providing access, participating in reenactments when asked. His familiarity with law enforcement procedure meant he understood what each step implied, even when nothing was said outright. The community, which had rallied strongly in the early days, began to recede slightly as weeks passed without resolution. People returned to work, to routine, carrying the story with them, but no longer living inside it. Offers of help continued, but less frequently. Behind closed doors, investigators began compiling timelines that did not rely on memory alone, aligning statements with records, distances with durations, movements with logs. The work was quiet, methodical, and largely invisible to those outside it. By the end of that month, the investigation had reached a point where searching farther out no longer made sense without a clearer understanding of what had happened closer in. The questions had narrowed. The window of time had tightened. What remained unresolved was no longer where Lily might be, but how she could have disappeared without triggering any of the signs that usually accompany such an event. And as those questions pressed inward, the case began to shift almost imperceptibly, from one defined by open land and distance to one shaped by proximity, routine, and the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the most important details are the ones that do not stand out at all until everything else has failed to explain them. The room where Michael Walker was brought that afternoon did not resemble a place of accusation, and that more than anything else made the conversation inside it difficult to navigate, because there were no raised voices, no harsh lighting, no sense of confrontation that would have allowed either side to retreat into defensiveness. It was a plain office, quiet, the kind of space used for explanations rather than confessions, where time was allowed to stretch until people filled it themselves. Michael sat at the table with his back straight, his hands resting where they could be seen, not because he was told to place them there, but because that was how he had learned to sit when matters became formal. Across from him, the investigator did not rush to speak, allowing the silence to settle long enough that it became part of the exchange rather than a gap to be filled. When the investigator finally spoke, his voice was steady and unhurried, shaped carefully to avoid sounding like a challenge. "What we're trying to understand," he said, leaning back slightly in his chair, "is not whether you did something wrong that morning, but how the morning itself unfolded minute by minute, because right now the shape of it doesn't quite sit the way it should." Michael nodded once slowly, his eyes focused not on the investigator but on a point just beyond him, as though looking directly might make the conversation narrower than it needed to be. "I've been over it already," Michael said. His voice even controlled the tone of someone used to explaining procedures rather than emotions. "I left the house to run. Lily was in the yard. Anna was nearby. Nothing was off. When I came back, Lily wasn't there." The investigator did not interrupt. He let the statement stand as it was. The reason we're revisiting it, he continued after a moment, is because when we place your usual route against the time you described, there's a small difference that keeps appearing, and on its own it wouldn't mean much, but combined with everything else, it becomes something we need to understand more clearly. Michael exhaled through his nose, a sound closer to acknowledgement than frustration. I didn't time the run, he said. I didn't check a watch. I went by feel the same way I always do. 20 minutes is an estimate, not a record. I understand that, the investigator replied, but estimates still come from habit, and habits have ranges. What I need from you is not the number you're comfortable with, but the longest version of that run you can imagine being true without it feeling wrong. Michael was quiet for several seconds, his jaw tightening slightly as he considered the question, not because it was confusing, but because it asked him to widen a space he had already tried to define. It could have been longer, he said finally. I might have gone farther than usual. I don't remember stopping, but that doesn't mean I didn't slow down. When you're running, time compresses. The investigator nodded again, accepting the explanation without comment, then shifted slightly in his seat. There's another detail we need to place in that same window, he said. Your patrol vehicle shows mileage that extends beyond what we would expect for routine use around that time. And again, this isn't an accusation, but it's something that needs to be accounted for in the same way the run does. Michael's eyes returned to the table now, his focus sharpening. I use that vehicle often, he said. Work doesn't always happen on a schedule, and not every movement gets logged the moment it happens. That's not unusual. No, the investigator agreed. It isn't. What makes it relevant here is timing. Everything we're looking at circles back to a very narrow span of minutes, and within that span, we have your run-the-vehicle mileage and Lily's disappearance overlapping in ways we can't yet align. Michael leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, not defensively but as though bracing himself against the repetition of the same question, wearing a different face. You're asking me to explain something I don't have an explanation for, he said, his voice still calm but carrying more weight now. If I knew where Lily went, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about estimates. The investigator did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was lower, more deliberate. What I'm asking, he said, is whether there's anything about that morning that felt different at the time, not in hindsight, not after everything that followed, but in the moment, anything at all that stood out and didn't register as important. Until later. Michael's gaze lifted again, this time holding steady. No, he said. It felt like every other morning. The room fell quiet again, not with tension, but with the kind of stillness that follows when a statement has been given all the weight it can carry. Outside the room, Rebecca Walker waited, her posture closed in on itself, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she stared at the floor, listening for voices through the door that never quite came through clearly enough to interpret. When Michael finally emerged, she looked up at him, searching his face for something she could recognize. They're just asking questions, he said to her, his voice unchanged, measured, careful not to introduce fear where none had yet been named. Rebecca nodded, though the movement was small, almost automatic. Later, when the room was empty again, the investigator sat alone for a moment, reviewing his notes without adding to them, aware that nothing had been said that could be called incriminating, and yet equally aware that the conversation had not resolved the one thing it needed to resolve: how a child could disappear from a yard in daylight within a window measured in minutes, without leaving behind a version of events that fully held together. And in that quiet, unanswered space, the investigation continued to turn inward, not because of what Michael Walker had said, but because of what remained just outside the reach of explanation. The days that followed that conversation did not announce themselves as a turning point, because nothing about them felt sudden or dramatic, and yet the atmosphere around the Walker household shifted in ways that were subtle enough to be denied but persistent enough to be felt by everyone who stepped inside. The search continued. The investigation moved forward, but the texture of daily life began to thin, as though the routines that once held the family together were now being performed without their original weight. Rebecca Walker spent most of her time inside the house, not because she was asked to stay there, but because leaving it felt like abandoning the last place where Lily had existed as part of the ordinary world. She moved through the rooms, slowly touching familiar objects without purpose, pausing at doorways as though expecting to hear small footsteps that never came. The toy car remained on a shelf near the front, no longer in the yard, its presence inside the house both comforting and unbearable. Michael Walker left the house more frequently now, attending meetings, responding to requests from investigators, placing himself where procedure required him to be. When he returned, he spoke less about what had been asked and more about what still needed to be done, his language precise, focused on process rather than outcome. He did not speculate. He did not express doubt. He spoke as someone holding himself together by structure alone. Anna moved quietly through the days, her behavior changing in ways that were easy to miss if one was not looking closely. She asked fewer questions. She watched more. When adults spoke, she listened without interrupting, absorbing tone rather than content. The mention of the truck did not come up again, not because it had been forbidden, but because the space around it had grown heavy enough to discourage repetition. As the investigation continued, officers returned to the house at intervals, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, their visits brief but focused. They walked through rooms they had already seen, asked about items that had already been described, clarified details that had already been given. The repetition was not aggressive. It was methodical. Rebecca answered when asked, though her responses grew shorter, not from reluctance, but from exhaustion. Michael remained cooperative, his familiarity with the process allowing him to anticipate questions before they were asked, though anticipation did not always produce clarity. At one point, an investigator spoke at length to both parents, his words, careful, measured, designed to explain, rather than alarm. "What we're doing now," he said, seated across from them at the same table where meals had once been shared, "is narrowing possibilities, not drawing conclusions. That means revisiting things that didn't stand out at first. It doesn't mean we believe anyone here did something wrong." Rebecca listened without looking up, her hands folded together so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. Michael nodded slowly, indicating understanding. "We're not asking you to remember more than you can," the investigator continued. "But if something comes back to you later, even if it feels insignificant, it matters." After the officer left, the house remained quiet for a long time. Rebecca eventually spoke, her voice low, as though raising it might disturb something fragile. "They keep asking the same thing," she said. "About the morning. About the time." Michael did not answer immediately. When he did, his words were steady, almost rehearsed. "That's how it works," he said. "They have to." Rebecca nodded, though the motion lacked conviction. Outside the house, the community's presence thinned further. Fewer cars stopped by. Fewer people walked the road calling Lily's name. The offers of help did not disappear entirely, but they became quieter, less frequent, shaped now by uncertainty rather than urgency. Posters appeared in nearby towns, then farther away, Lily's face printed beneath brief descriptions and contact numbers, the image both familiar and distant at the same time. Rebecca looked at one once, then turned away, unable to reconcile the photograph with the absence that now filled her days. Behind the scenes, investigators continued their work, aligning statements, reviewing logs, comparing timelines, not rushing toward a conclusion but allowing inconsistencies to surface at their own pace. The process was slow, deliberately, so built on the understanding that pressure could distort memory rather than clarify it. Michael's movements were noted more carefully now, not because he had done anything overtly suspicious, but because proximity had become relevant. He was present during the narrow window in which Lily disappeared, and that fact alone required attention. He was aware of this, even if it was never stated directly. Rebecca sensed the shift before it was spoken, not through accusation but through absence, through the way conversations changed when she entered a room, through the way questions were framed with greater care. She did not voice this awareness. She carried it quietly. At night, the house felt larger, its silence heavier. Rebecca lay awake, listening for sounds that did not come, while Michael lay beside her, his breathing steady, his presence both reassuring and distant. Anna slept fitfully, her dreams unsettled, though she did not speak of them. Days turned into weeks without resolution. The search expanded and contracted, adapted and reorganized, but Lily did not return. The land gave nothing back. The road carried on as it always had, indifferent to the questions pressed into it. What remained was a family suspended in a moment that refused to close, an investigation that continued to circle the same hours, and a house that no longer functioned as a place of rest, but as a container for waiting. And as time moved forward without answers, one truth became impossible to avoid, even if it was never spoken aloud inside the Walker home. Whatever had happened to Lily had occurred close, quietly, and within a space so familiar that it took days, then weeks, to even begin to look at it, without the comfort of assumption. If you stayed with this story until the end, Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support this work, you can subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts below. And before you go, I'm curious, where did you first hear about this case or what led you here today?